States has unchanging interests. So now what we have are multiple centers of power, asymmetric threats, unchanging interests around the world. I would also argue that while we've done a good job of assessing the post-Cold War world, at least we now have 11 years of doing it, and it looks, unfortunately, worse than some, even in this room, might have predicted back in 1989. But we are still trying to define what role we expect our own country to play and what role we want our military forces to play in this world. This has important implications for military professionals. To maintain our preeminence in all aspects of warfighting, we must be able to dominate and exercise control across the spectrum. Across the spectrum. We cannot be so precise that we structure and design and equip ourselves to fight and win tactical battles and maybe operational battles and lose the strategic fight. And I might just drop as a footnote here, some of our experiences in Vietnam might cause all of us to step back and think about that. We must win, fight and win and dominate whatever the situation is, from the low end of the spectrum to the high end of the spectrum, tactically, operationally, and strategically. Now, the United States of America wants to improve the neighborhood, not just punish transgressors, which, interestingly enough, I expect is why we're in the Balkans today and elsewhere. We want to spread the benefits of market democracies to billions of people around the world that are still living in fear of conflict and poverty. Certainly the most recent discussion about General Electric and Honeywell is an interesting case in point to everybody who wonders if the world is global or not. Global world, the United States has global economics interests. Now, transforming the Army in the present context, a balanced approach that looks at everything across the board. And Major General Jim Graziaplane is here to talk about how the Army is approaching that issue. What are the locations of potential conflict? What are the choices? Getting there. How do you project the United States Army? How do you project the United States Army to faraway places? During the Gulf War, it took us 150 days essentially to project the force to the Gulf, which all things considered is not bad, given that most of what we thought we were going to do in the 60s, 70s, and 80s involved Central Europe. And we picked this large force up, almost 300,000 people, and projected them to Saudi Arabia. And fought and then inactivated the units. The United States Army, along with the Navy and government dollars, has cut that power projection time in half. They can do today in 75 days what took 150 days to do in 1990 and 91. Being there, we still had forward deployed forces, presence on the ground, influence. The Koreans have a proverb that says you listen more closely to a neighbor than to a visitor. And being on the ground has a sense of power unto itself. There's an interesting book that's been reviewed in the New York Times and elsewhere by Tony Vaccaro, who was a photographer. He was an infantryman in the United States Army, the 83rd Division in World War II. He had a camera, like most soldiers today. He had a camera. He was a rifleman, and then he became a photographer, and he stayed in Germany until 1949. If you want an interesting view of what troops on the ground accomplishes, take a look at those pictures. Take a look at those very evocative pictures where you see a flattened Germany, and then think about Germany today. Pictures of the Air Force flying the Berlin airlift and so forth. Major implications of forces on the ground, presence on the ground, boots on the ground. Now, there are broader issues to be looked at. The Army must be an institution prepared to do what the nation requires, designed to perform not a narrow parochial set of tasks based on what we think the world is, but we have to design it so that it can accomplish emerging missions and tasks and have a close relationship, complementary relationship with the other services, all of whom are represented in this room. It must be a complementary force. Each of the forces brings power to the table. And by the way, we also have to have relationships and we have to have links with other countries. Force policies that provide the right mix of active and reserve soldiers. I think one of the strengths of the United States of America is found in our reserve forces, men and women who are willing to give of themselves in uniform for their country. And I'm not sure we completely recognize the power of that and acknowledge it in an institutional way. It, I think, is one of the enduring strengths of America that people who have other jobs, other tasks, are willing to put on a uniform and stand up and say, hey, I'm willing to produce for my country in a legitimate institutional way. I'm not talking about militias now out there in some woods someplace. I'm talking about real people doing legitimate things for the institution. All right, so I think we have to recognize that. Now, transformation must be based on thought, a clear, comprehensive articulation of what we are expected to face, that is, the world as it is, and we expect it to be for the next 5 to 10 years. I would think 5 years is about as far as you really can go with some visionary thinking out to 10 years. Doctrinal transformation, and the Army has just published, Chief of Staff just released a new doctrine, which I know General Graziaplane will talk about. The first one was done in 1993. After the war, after the Cold War. It was an early attempt, but clearly in 1993 we hadn't had the experience under our belt. You know, Somalia didn't happen until October of 93, Rwanda, on and on and on. We really learned a lot. Okay, so doctrinal transformation must proceed slightly ahead of the organizations and the equipment. Although we have stated, the chief has stated and is doing some experiments on his interim force and then his objective force. And he is addressing all aspects of the United States Army, all the way from the sharp end of the spear with the interim combat brigades at Fort Lewis to the objective force, which is out there in the future, a much lighter force, a holistic force that will accommodate both air vehicles, including the Air Force and the Navy air platforms, and ground formations, and be deployable and sustainable in the field. There are challenges. Transformation must be supported. And in America, where you have changes of administrations and changes of leadership, there are various views. And maintaining long-term consistency on equipment transformation is a challenge for everyone. Buying the enablers. How do you buy the enablers when software is changing every 6 months? And you get differing views, and you get, frankly, newer equipment all the time. Transformation doesn't take place in a vacuum. And certainly the Secretary of Defense's appearance this morning on the Hill is a manifestation of that. This is America, and everybody gets a vote, or at least everybody gets a voice. Other missions and the needs of other missions and other services have to be balanced. Transformation comes with choices. Silver bullet high-end solutions give the nation a one-dimensional capability to punish from afar. We must win the tactical, operational, and strategic fight, and we must be able to handle asymmetric threats. And I think the 1,500-word article in the New York Times about the conflict between the PLO and the Israelis is very evocative to think about the application of the power, the military and political and economic power of a nation. How do you apply it? How do you apply it